Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Today I'm starting what I hope will develop into a new series that I'm calling Work in Progress, where I'll take a look at an early or beta version of a game that came out long before its official release and is different in some significant ways. And yeah, I know the name's not all that catchy, we'll see what happens with that. For this inaugural episode, I'll be taking a look at an early prototype of Castlevania Bloodlines for the Genesis/Mega Drive. If you weren't aware, Bloodlines went under the name Castlevania the New Generation in Europe and Australia, and Vampire Killer in Japan. I'll be looking at what's been dubbed the 0.5 prototype of the game today and showing you stuff from it by itself, along with a few comparisons of how things came out in the final game. Alrighty, let's get on with it. First up, if you think I'm the first person to ever talk about this prototype of Castlevania Bloodlines,
well, you're wrong!
But still, it's worth looking at from a fresh perspective here in the magical time of 2026, don't you think? Well, whether or not you do, I'm doing it anyway, and you're welcome to come along for the ride. First, a little about the prototype versus the finished game. The completed game, Castlevania Bloodlines, was released in the US in March of 1994. It was the only Castlevania title to appear on Sega's 16-bit home system, and frankly, it's my favorite Castlevania game of its generation. It just had a greater level of intensity and was much more kinetic than the still great SNES or PC Engine titles in the series in my opinion. Enemies were fast in Bloodlines, explosions were big, the game was challenging but fun, and had an amazing FM soundtrack from Michiru Yamane, who would go on to compose songs for Symphony of the Night along with many other games in the series. Despite some admittedly rough visual edges in Bloodlines, I played it more than any of the other 16-bit era titles in the end. Now, Bloodlines was shown in various stages of progress while it was being developed in several magazines back in the day, primarily EGM. We would see some areas that started out looking pretty vacant or plain eventually grow to have unique artwork or characters placed in them, and slowly the game began to take shape. Now, there are two prototypes that I know of that have been floating around on the good old interwebs the last few years. There's the 0.1 prototype that apparently only has a bit of the first two stages, and that was released into the wild on July 1st of 2018. That one is dated August 4th, 1993. Then there was a much more complete prototype, version 0.5, that was dated October 7th, 1993, and was released onto the World Wide Web on August 12th, 2021. This one had parts of 5 stages, included a basically complete stage 1 with some sprites and other little things that would be changed later. There is also a level select code which lets you access otherwise inaccessible parts of the game. And we're going to look at 2 versions of this 0.5 prototype today. The original that was dubbed with no extras, and a fixed version that let people play it more naturally by repairing a major glitch. So what's the difference in the 2 versions? Well, in the original version, there's a collision detection problem between your character and some platforms that are made out of sprites. There's also a fixed version of this that resolves the collision detection issue, but seems to have created a few other minor glitches of its own. Let's kick things off with the original unchanged prototype. Now, I've seen it stated that there was no collision detection coded between your characters and certain sprites, which prevented you from walking on them. But that's not exactly what I personally observed here. Instead, it looks like the coordinates for where the sprite is physically located on the screen don't match the coordinates being checked by the collision detection. Now, I noticed if you're standing in an area with a sprite you can walk on, it registers collision if you're way to the left of it. See that little raft moving down right now? That's happening because it's perceiving my character is stepping on it even though I'm nowhere near it. Now, because of this issue, several areas, starting with the one where you whip sections out of the foreground down in stage 2 to have them become platforms, are completely impassable no matter which character you use. And rather hilariously, you die instantly when starting the second level boss fight because the screen begins with your character dropped onto a raft as it floats down, but you miss the raft and go straight through it and just drown. So speaking of dying in this prototype, the death animation is different from the final game as well. In the complete retail game, when a character dies, they kind of glow and float upwards. In this prototype version, when a character dies, they become a skeleton, more akin to ghosts and goblins and ghouls and ghosts. For changes from retail, John's idle animation is paced a little bit differently in the prototype version. For Eric, his walking animation is quite a bit different. In the proto version, he holds his spear up on his shoulder while he walks. In the later retail release, he holds his spear downward and his upper body animation frames are noticeably changed from the prototype. Now, John's standard whip sound is also very different here, and jumping and swinging from a roof using John is a little bit rougher in the prototype than the full completed version. Now, you'll probably also notice as I play through this that several sound effects are different between the retail release and this prototype, and several sound effects are missing from the prototype entirely. Almost all of the present effects also sound worse, so the changes made before the game was completed were definitely for the best. Also, neither visual nor auditory feedback are good when you strike enemies in the prototype. It can sometimes be hard to tell if you've actually made contact with enemies that take multiple hits to destroy. Another change is the 3 classic Castlevania songs, which are also present in the retail version. They play automatically in this game when you get the 3rd weapon level. There are no tricks or secrets required. Now, as we head into the small underground section here, you can see that the mermen look entirely different in the prototype. They look a lot more basic and more snake-like, and are somewhat reminiscent of the mermen from NES Castlevania, but definitely not the same. Now, the mermen in the retail release of the game look absolutely great, but it's funny, I always thought they were a little bit over-designed for basic enemies that only take a hit to take out. But either way you slice it, they are a lot different between both versions of the game here. And another enemy in Stage 1 that looks a little bit different is the mid-boss of the level. Here in this final retail release, it looks like this. A muscly, demonic dog missing a bunch of flesh in its lower half, and when you kill it, it collapses into a horrible, messy heap. Now also, your character walks off to the right of the screen automatically after you kill it and the game progresses. Meanwhile, in the prototype, the demon dog thing looks like this. I definitely like the final design better than this prototype version. In the prototype, it just, I don't know, looks a little bit amateurish. It's one of those things where I really hope it was just kind of a placeholder at first, but either way, I am glad they changed it. Another thing here to finish up Stage 1 is when we defeat a boss and collect an orb, the level ends in a freeze frame almost immediately in the prototype, while in the retail release, you get a few seconds where you can jump around and strike in different directions before the freeze frame happens. Alright, as level 2 begins, we can see there are a few things that changed right off the bat. The large Minotaur enemies in the prototype take more hits to kill than in the retail release, even on the game's highest difficulty in the retail release. Now when we get to this section where it auto-scrolls upward, the little spark enemies that move along the platforms look different. In the prototype, they have more little individual sparks that animate around a small, more solid central core. In the final game, they're much more solid all around. And they're a little easier to see in the final game, so I'd say that was a positive change. For some of the mid-boss fights in this stage, the music doesn't change, the life bars don't work in the prototype, and we really start seeing progressively more missing enemies as we go along. For the big armor mid-boss here, there are some minor visual differences, especially if you look at his weapon, and then after you kill the first armor boss, the one wielding an axe comes out from the right side of the screen in the prototype, instead of the left side as it does in the final retail release. Now, going down in the original prototype here is doable, but it's a little tough because of the collision detection glitch. Watch the rafts on the right side of the screen when you're on the left, and wait until the last second to jump down, and you'll most likely be able to do this and avoid a drowning death. To progress more naturally and easily, you really gotta switch to the fixed prototype ROM. Now in the next section, if you're playing this legit, this is where your journey will come to an abrupt end. Shortly after whacking the head off the giant statue, the collision glitch will prevent you from going further to the right, since we can't walk on the sprite from the foreground that we just smashed downward. But fear not, as I mentioned, there's a level select in the game. You can do it from the start menu with the normal Konami code. Up, up, down, down, left, right, BA. So when you do that, you'll see some numbers pop up in the upper left corner of the screen. You can use the A, B, and C buttons on your controller to modify those numbers and select the scene that you want to go straight to. And the Cutting Room Floor website, which I'll link in the description, has a list of what numbers correspond to what stages. After that, we have 2 screens that go down with the charging Minotaur enemies, instead of just one like the retail release, and they look totally different. I don't know if Konami had originally decided to just go with these colors at first, or if maybe these were just some kind of placeholder graphics or even a glitch, because it looks pretty rough here in the prototype. Things look much better in the final retail release. Oh, and here's what happens when you go into the boss fight in the original prototype. Yep, good old Insta-Death. Now here's a look at the boss fight with the fixed prototype. I'll put the retail version up next to it as well, so you can see that there's some color differences between the proto and final versions. Alrighty folks, now I'm going to dramatically speed things up here because the rest of the game is much less complete than these first 2 levels. So stage 3 begins with a really weird parallax effect in the grass, which is a lot weirder than the one we'd see in the final version. And the harpies that show up at the beginning here are not carrying any spears in the prototype either, but they are in the full version. And then once we get to the rotating tower, in the original prototype, you can't do this stage at all because of the collision detection glitch. In the fixed prototype, you can complete this stage. And the clouds behind the tower scroll in the prototype, but not in the finished version. In this section, there were a bunch of little layout and enemy position changes for things like some of the platforms and some of the mummies and stuff. The last major change in this stage is the outside portion of the tower. The platforms are roughly half as wide in the prototype as they are in the final release. Also, because of the collision glitch in the original prototype, you cannot complete this stage in that version. Now you can complete it in the fixed prototype. And while I felt it was a little nerve-wracking with the smaller platforms, in practice, the controls didn't really feel any different and I didn't fall off any edges while jumping or anything, which I fully expected to. Now the boss fight here is a visual glitch fest in the prototype, but is completable at least in the fixed version. Now on a hilarious note, even in the fixed version, if you beat the boss in the prototype and let the orb fall through the floor at the end, you can never complete the level. It'll just stay here forever. But hey, you've got that handy dandy stage select in both prototypes, so you're good there. Now for stage 4, we've got quite a few changes. We're missing the skeletons inside the oil drums in this first section. None of the skeletons have helmets on in the prototype either. For the next area, the colors and layout are completely different in the proto versus final versions of the game. Also, there are no candles in this stage of the prototype and barely any enemies. In the original prototype, because of the collision glitch, you can't walk on the treads or conveyor belt things in the correct place, but you can in the fixed prototype. Some other parts of the area here have no enemies at all. In a bit of an interesting twist, in this part with all the giant pistons, the layout and movement of the pistons is completely different in the prototype, and you travel from the top of the screen down to the bottom. In the final game, you travel from the bottom of the area up to the top and the pistons move in a different way. Next up in the prototype, we have a completely new forge area that did not make it into the final release. Now in the original prototype, it's almost impossible to make any progress here because of the collision glitch. In the fixed prototype, you can almost complete the entire area, but not quite. There will be a section all the way to the right that is uncrossable because it's a giant gap with no platforms and you can't swing on the ceiling or anything like that. So back to the level select if we want to move on. The areas with the gears have some minor color and layout changes, and progress is difficult to impossible in some parts in the original prototype. In the fixed version of the prototype, however, this area is completely passable. Next we have this area with the Zeppelin in the background, and it's a little sparse in the prototype. There are no enemies and not a whole lot to do other than jump on a swinging platform or do some whip swings or spear jumps. This Zeppelin area is not in the final version at all, and was replaced with a different area where we have all these weight-sensitive platforms and hooks and ghosts and stuff. Now sadly, the Frankenstein's monster mid-boss is missing from the prototype, and the area with the spinning blades is simplified and has no enemies in the proto version. The next few areas have super glitchy graphics in the prototype, but are completable, at least in the fixed version. But don't worry, there are plenty more glitches to come, including when you fight the boss. If you can manage to defeat him, he never drops the orb that you need to finish the level. And his life bar works a little weirdly also, as it does with several other bosses and mid-bosses. For some bosses, the life bar just shows blank the whole time you fight them in this prototype. For others, like this one, they manage to live on past 0 health, but will eventually go down after a few extra hits. Now the last stage in the prototype is stage 5, and here's the glitch fest I promised. Aside from that, this area is pretty barren with just some of the leaf circles that attack you and pretty much nothing else. The layout is a lot simpler and it's a lot shorter than we would see in the final release. And the next area has nothing in it at all.
Nothing at all.
No candles, no enemies whatsoever. It's also missing the effect foreground layer where the light and shadow that lines scroll gently shifting from leaning right to leaning to the left in the final retail release. Most of the stages in this level are missing enemies of any kind. The next area for John is missing all enemies and candles once again. Now if we were playing as Eric, there was a prior screen where there's an area where you can use his spear vault ability to go upwards and access a different part of the level. That is in the prototype, and it is completable. It's more easy to do in the fixed version, but you can technically still do it with some difficulty in the pure version. Anyway, once we reach the end of this area, we'll see the boss music starts. And in the retail version of the game, this is where the pillar comes to life. We have the two faces that are facing each other, shoot a bunch of little sparkly balls out and everything. But in the prototype, the boss music starts and then nothing happens. Back to the good old stage select. Now going down this incline is much smoother in the retail release than it is in the prototype, where it's just a janky mess. But it's worth it to reach the boss fight, because the princess here looks completely different in both the proto and retail releases. She's a lot larger and more detailed in the prototype, but maybe a tad garish. Defeat her in her human form and we'll get her moth version. Now the moth version of the princess in the prototype retains some of her human traits or human-like traits, but in the retail release, once you defeat her as a human, she goes full-on giant moth. Now, after that, none of level 6 is present in the prototype except the Dracula fight. This is a simpler version of the Dracula fight than we'd eventually see in the final retail release, but most of the elements are here already. What's kind of interesting is check out the stage number in the upper right. In the final version, this fight takes place as stage 611. In the prototype, it's stage 410. I also think it's really interesting that Dracula has pretty much all of his forms here, most of his attack patterns and everything, even though a lot of the other stuff that needs to be in the game isn't there yet. Alright, allow me to summarize and wrap this up. Visually, there are several small changes from the prototype 0.5 version of Castlevania Bloodlines and the full retail release of the game. Some enemy characters, like the merman, were pretty significantly changed, many were not. Eric's walking animation is a bit different, as I mentioned as well. When it comes to sound and music, well, the music in the prototype is about the same as it is in the final version as far as I can tell, but many of the sound effects are either worse in the prototype or absent entirely. And you'd expect that from an early work-in-progress version of the game. I want to be clear, I'm not reviewing or criticizing the prototype here, this was a work in progress after all. Now for gameplay, there's the collision detection glitch in the original prototype that makes natural progression impossible in many areas. But the fixed version of the prototype allows for much better sort of natural progress, but there are still some areas that you can't complete and will have to go and use the level select if you want to see everything. In the end, it was interesting giving this prototype a look and seeing what changed in the few months between the prototype's date and the final release of Bloodlines. And as much as I love Castlevania Bloodlines, I do wish they'd fixed maybe a couple of more things before the final release. Namely, I always found the walking animation on stairs a little weird, and I think they could have moved the characters up a pixel or two off the floors to make them look a little natural. They look like they're set a little too low. But anyway, those are my thoughts on the prototype. So what do you guys think? Is this the first time that you've seen this prototype of the game? Have you come across this stuff before? Have you ever tried this one out yourself? Tell me all about it in the comments. And that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. That's the only way my little channel here can continue to grow. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll find out whenever any of my videos get released. If you want to support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like super thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.